And 3. It's our privilege to hear the thoughts of a governor, therefore, who has been in the hot seat thinking about and addressing climate change for the past 7 years. So please welcome Governor Kulongoski. Not too personal, I hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Margaret, for your introduction. You said something I have to respond to, and that is that when I left the court, my wife is a graduate of this institution at the University of Oregon Law School, and her parents were academics back east and taught law school. And I always tell the story that I was the son-in-law in our family when I was on the Supreme Court. My father-in-law and I used to, with opinions, I'd get them back and there'd be red marks on them. This makes no sense. You know, what are you talking about? And when I had to call him and tell him that I was going to leave the court and run for governor, you have to understand, in their family, this was a step down. And I am no longer the son-in-law in the family. I'm just one of them. So it is a great pleasure to be here with you. And it is wonderful to be back in Eugene, where I started my 4-decade-long service in public service for the state from this community. As you might imagine, now that I'm coming to the end of my term, I'm frequently asked, what will I do next? I don't have an answer yet, but of course I can assure you that I am thinking about it. One choice that has been often suggested is teaching a class in something I know best: government, public policy, and the law. Now, I have to tell you that teaching would be a change, and I'm looking out right now and I'm standing in front of some very bright and well-prepared young people wondering, are they trying to keep up with me, or probably the truth is, I'm trying to keep up with you. With that in mind, I'd like to read a few sentences from Mason Druckmann's political biography of Wayne Morris, who first came to Eugene because he had been hired to teach at the University of Oregon Law School. Druckmann writes, Dean Carpenter assigned him all of the classes on property, an area he hadn't studied since his undergraduate years. At the outset, he had to do considerable cramming just to keep a step ahead of the students. So at the very least, being here today puts me in the very best company. You and the extraordinary man this great center of learning was named after, Wayne Morris. Even for the most experienced teacher or elected official, keeping a step ahead of students is a very interesting and rewarding challenge. That is especially true at the Wayne Morris Center for Law and Politics, because you are taking on difficult issues that have no easy answers. And right now, there is none more difficult than climate change. Let me clarify what I just said. I don't believe the science of climate change is still in question. And while some might disagree, for purposes of my comments today, I start with the premise that the science of climate change is not a theory, but a proven fact with potentially devastating consequences. Rising sea levels endanger our coastal communities and transportation system. Less snowpack means less water for fish, agriculture, recreation, and domestic use. Drier weather can cause catastrophic forest fires, and warmer temperatures threaten Oregon's land-based economy. This is why almost 2 years ago I said this: the toughest truth we have to face is the fact that days of cheap, plentiful energy that can be extracted without concern about the environment are over, and they are not coming back. That's why we need new thinking. We need the courage to make hard decisions and pragmatic compromises. And at least for the near term, we need to accept solutions that may not be to everyone's liking. To prove my point, here is a list of the 7 most recognized forms of carbon-neutral energy: geothermal, solar, biomass, nuclear, wind, water, and wave. And even though it is not carbon neutral, you can add natural gas, which is much cleaner burning than oil or coal. Now put yourself in my position as governor. You are used to hearing from supporters of the extraction industries that produce non-renewables and the large industries that rely upon them. They're concerned about the cost of conversion to renewables and their availability. But every form of energy I mentioned has other opponents, all or most of whom would be the first to admit that climate change is real, that climate change must be reversed, and that climate change requires reducing our use of fossil fuels. Geothermal. There's understandable concern about damage to the Newberry crater and other environmentally sensitive areas here in Oregon. Solar. People in Lakeview are worried about their quality of life being damaged by a large parabolic solar array. Wind. Some are already derisively calling it big wind. There is major concerns about the loss of vistas and open space, especially near the Columbia Gorge and Steam Mountain, as we build thousands of new turbines. Water. Most dams do not produce hydroelectric power. If those dams are converted to energy production, they take water away from agriculture, fish, and recreation. Nuclear takes large amounts of water, and the waste storage problem has yet to be solved. Biomass. First of all, some argue biomass is not carbon neutral. But even if it is, biomass raises concerns about noxious emissions and the threat they may pose to public health. Wave. Coastal communities and people who fish, and that is their livelihood, don't like the buoys, and neither do advocates for marine mammals. As for natural gas, even though it is relatively plentiful and produces less CO2 than other fossil fuels, the debate and pushback about natural gas can be summed up in 3 letters: LNG. You can make a good policy argument that the need to fight climate change and reduce CO2 emissions outweigh all of these objections to renewable energy. But if you are a policymaker, even when your own supporters agree with you about the problem, they may not agree with you about the solution. That's why I think climate change, even without getting into the issue of cap and trade, will be a long and difficult battlefront in Oregon. It is going to engender vigorous debate, demand careful analysis, and require the willingness to compromise. So I congratulate you for making climate change and the ethics and equities of climate change a major area of study and analysis at the Wayne Moore Center. What you are learning here, writing about here, and struggling to resolve is part of a larger debate being carried out in Washington, D.C., in the different regions of our country, in Salem, in boardrooms, and without doubt, in great universities like this one. That's the way it should be. Government alone will not be able to balance the competing interest, pay the cost, and solve the fundamental problems of climate change. You, the citizens of this state and this country, need to be part of the solution too. My attitude about the importance of climate change hasn't changed since I became governor. What has changed is policy, law, investment, and the public's belief that with regard to climate change, Oregon must not only act and act now, it must lead. That's exactly what we've been doing since 2003. Let me give you a brief summary of the legal and policy changes we've made and programs we've created since I was elected governor. The place to begin is conservation, because while we certainly need to move toward renewable energy, the fact is conservation and more energy-efficient buildings, homes, and appliances are the fastest, cheapest, and most effective way to reduce CO2 emissions. Using tax incentives, Oregon is one of the leading states for energy-efficient buildings, commercial and residential. We're similarly at the forefront of using tax credits to encourage the purchase of hybrid cars, and we're testing new loan programs for retrofitting homes and buildings to make them more energy efficient. Much remains to be done in the electricity sector, but the potential savings are huge. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council estimates that 85% of the anticipated load growth could be met through energy conservation and efficiency. Here's another often unrecognized form of conservation: preserving historic buildings. In January, I signed an executive order that directs all state agencies to first consider historic downtowns when locating or relocating their offices. This saves energy because downtowns are walkable, reducing congestion and emissions. Also, putting old buildings to new use is the ultimate in recycling. Demolition is wasteful, and our landfills are already overtaxed. It makes sense to reuse buildings and keep them out of the waste system. That said, we have to be realistic. We cannot simply conserve our way out of this problem. That's why in 2003, I entered the first regional partnership in the West with the governors of Washington and California to combat global warming, including a clean car program and state-specific reduction goals. This became known as what you know today as the Western Climate Initiative. The goals of the WCI are being met in part by reducing diesel idling, appliance efficiency, and promoting the use of alternative fuels. In 2004, I created the Global Warming Advisory Group, co-chaired by Dr. Jane Lipchenko, who is now head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Over the next 3 years, we developed a renewable energy action plan to aggressively develop wind, solar, geothermal, and other forms of renewable energy, increase the use of ethanol and biodiesel in state cars, remove regulatory barriers to the development of wind energy, and sign bills to expand the residential energy tax credit and make it easier to site biofuel facilities. Biofuels raise an important social issue that I will talk about shortly. I also used my veto pen. In 2005, I vetoed a bill that would have prevented adoption of restrictions on tailpipe emissions. In 2006, I put together a renewable energy working group, and in 2007 championed 3 landmark bills that grew out of the recommendations of that working group. The first sets a renewable electricity standard, requiring a 25% of a utility's electricity resources coming from renewable energy by 2025. The second requires that the state's gasoline supply be 10% ethanol and 2.5% of the state's diesel supply be biodiesel. And third, we expanded the business energy tax credit and then put sidewalls around it this last year, in February, to make sure companies don't abuse the system, but actually help grow our economy and truly invest in clean energy and clean energy jobs. In the same year, 2007, we codified the greenhouse reduction goals I announced in 2005, passed an electronic equipment take-back bill, invested in wave energy, and required new state buildings and major renovations to spend 1.5% of their capital budgets on solar energy. In 2008, I hosted a summit on Oregon's energy future to come up with a planning process to move Oregon toward clean, renewable energy while addressing the immediate issues of price stability and supply certainty. Soon after, I signed an executive order creating the Oregon Energy Planning Council. The council will issue periodic reports. The first is expected at the end of this year. It's about what energy we use and how we will meet the demand and supply, price, transmission, law changes, and strategies for going forward. Then in February, we took more steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including tax credits for plug-in and all electric vehicles, increased investment in energy efficiency, and a program to pay for electricity produced in homes and small businesses. I've talked about why converting to new renewable energy sources can often raise difficult policy choices, and some of the steps we've taken since 2003 to advance a strong climate change agenda in Oregon. If climate change policy was just about the environment, I could probably bring my remarks to a quick conclusion by telling you that I'm going to continue to work on this issue as long as I'm governor, and will urge the next governor to do the same. But fighting climate change in Oregon is not just about stewardship of the environment. It provides other benefits, is a bridge to other policy goals, and supports important Oregon values. In that sense, a comprehensive and forceful policy of reducing CO2 emissions is not just the right thing for preserving our natural resources, it is also the smart thing for building a stable, predictable, socially equitable, and economically prosperous future. Let me start with what I think is the most important policy goal in addition to protecting the environment, of reducing our carbon footprint substantially and permanently. Energy security. In my State of the State speech earlier this month, I tried to put my remarks into a broader context. I want Oregonians to understand the economic conditions under which I was making policy decisions, especially 2 long and deep recessions. But I pointed out that the larger context also included 2 wars. Oregon has lost more than 100 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. In the next few days, I'll be welcoming home a very large contingent of Oregon National Guard soldiers who have been serving in Iraq. Many have done multiple deployments. My purpose today is not to debate the merits of the war. That will be for history to judge. But I will ask this question: does anyone seriously believe that we would have invaded Iraq and stayed there for more than 7 years if that country didn't have large and huge oil reserves? I think the answer to that question is no. The United States consumes 20 million barrels of oil each day, 57% of which is imported. 23% of our imports come from the Persian Gulf. And while we produce 10% of the world's oil, we consume 23% of it. So while America's appetite for non-domestic sources of oil continues unabated, the growing economies of India and China will put upward pressure on both demand and price. Andrew Revkin put it this way recently in the New York Times. Even with spreading efforts to conserve energy, a world heading toward roughly 9 billion people seeking decent lives will require far more of this resource than today's supplies and systems can provide. This means there is no way to separate the debate about climate change from the debate about energy security. We need to move forward toward energy independence at the same time we move forward toward lower CO2 emissions. Some might see this as 2 problems that need to be solved. I see it as one opportunity that needs to be taken advantage of. For me, and perhaps for most of you, reducing CO2s is an end in itself. But reducing CO2 can also be a means to an end, and that end is energy security. So even if your politics lean toward the conservative side, or you're writing policy papers inside a conservative think tank, and you rail against efforts to reduce our carbon footprint, chances are you agree that the United States must have more control over its energy destiny. Giving our energy proxy to rich oil but politically unstable or unfriendly countries is a threat to both our national security and our economy. If there is a bipartisan consensus on anything, there should be a bipartisan consensus on that. I often frame the issue this way. Energy security equals economic and environmental security, which equals national security. In other words, if we are increasing our energy supply, if we make our increasing our energy supply a national project, not unlike the interstate highway system or reaching the moon, and we work together to bring Oregon and make Oregon a leader in that national project, then I believe we can expect green energy and green technology companies to move here to Oregon, thousands of new family wage jobs to be created here, our research and development infrastructure, both in the private sector and our universities, to be expanded here, and the cost of non-carbon-based energy to be affordable here. At the same time, as my formula indicates, energy security will strengthen our national security. Our diplomacy will be able to escape the straitjacket of dependence on foreign oil. We'll be able to reduce our overseas military commitments. There will be less tension in competition with our allies as their demand for energy grows, and there will be fewer and fewer days in which Oregon families say a permanent goodbye to a hero in uniform. In addition to energy security, I mentioned two additional policy goals that are achieved when we invest in renewable energy and make a state, regional, and national commitment to reducing CO2 emissions. One is growing the economy by attracting green technology and green energy companies. We are already seeing that here in Oregon. Oregon leads the nation in the manufacture of photovoltaic solar cells and continues to attract wind energy companies. The second policy is innovation and entrepreneurship. By investing in renewable energy and clean technology, everything from fuel cells to smarter electrical transmission systems to green buildings to public transportation, we make new discoveries, attract new science and engineering talent, grow new businesses, and improve our chances of winning competitive federal dollars. But innovation is not just about large science and engineering projects. It is also about small things that add up to big savings in energy. We want to give homeowners incentives to produce their own clean energy and sell what they don't use through a feed-in tariff system. And we want to have the most energy-efficient buildings in the nation, which is why Oregon's building codes are already among the most green in the nation. Oregon has always been a laboratory for change, especially around issues relating to our natural resources. It is, as I've said many times, part of our DNA. So I know we will continue to innovate from the way we conserve water to the way we use plants to cool buildings, and in doing so, help lead America to a clean energy future. Strengthening our economy, creating jobs, investing in public transit, and building partnerships with other regional governments, as we did with the Western Climate Initiative, are just some of the broader policy goals that fighting climate change helps us achieve. But I'd like to conclude my remarks not with policy goals that can be measured in numbers, how many jobs, how many federal dollars, how many new businesses, how many tons of CO2 reduced or sequestered, but with the social issues that are certain to be part of any inquiry about climate change and climate equities. Choosing to be a national leader in cutting greenhouse gas emissions and making the investments necessary to expand our use of non-carbon energy is the very best and in the very best tradition of Oregon. Investing in renewable energy is as much about our values as it is about our energy future. Values we can strengthen if we remember that fighting climate change is also a fight to better the lives of all Oregonians. I noted in my State of the State address that the people of Oregon, and I quoted, refused to trade their stewardship for our land and water for short-term economic gain. This is as it should be. I believe we must continue our long history of finding new ways to protect our God-given treasures. From the beach bill to the urban growth boundary to the toughest renewable energy portfolio standards in the country, Oregon always leads the way. It is a source of pride, a statement of our values, and a reaffirmation of who we are as a people and what we believe. That's why turning our back on the fight against climate change would be nothing less than turning our back on history. But it is not just history that we must never turn our back on. Our values also demand that we protect the countless Oregonians who live in economically distressed parts of this state. Climate change policy must be about them too. That's because their jobs are often on the line during periods of great economic and environmental transition, the kind of transition we're experiencing with our move to renewable energy. So yes, bringing green technology companies to Oregon opens up new opportunities for communities that have long depended on industries that either extract carbon or rely on it. This will not happen overnight. In the meantime, social equity and fundamental fairness demands that those of us who make policy do everything we can to assure that Oregon families have the opportunity to provide for themselves and make a decent standard of living. Jobs are not the only equity issue that needs to be taken into account as we move forward on reducing CO2 emissions. There are also the issues of cost, location, and the use of certain biofuels. Green energy is not the same as cheap energy. At least in the near term, the cost of energy is likely to increase as we phase out coal and build the infrastructure needed to bring wind, solar, biomass, and other forms of renewable energy into the grid. For families that have lost jobs and are already having trouble paying their bills, higher energy costs aren't just an inconvenience, they're a hardship. The recession has already caused enough pain for these families. Their economic future must be protected as we determine the pace of change and path of change toward reductions in greenhouse gases. As for location, climate change policy, for all of its benefits, can also threaten Oregon's quality of life. As I mentioned, renewable energy can also lead to vistas and open spaces being obscured or destroyed by wind turbines and large solar arrays. Biomass facilities often emit noxious odors, and pipelines carrying natural gas threaten pristine wilderness areas and farms, as do new transmission lines. Lastly, there is the issue of corn-based ethanol and other biofuels made from food. I am not in favor of these kinds of biofuels because they drive up the cost of corn and other commodities grown on farms. The reason is simple. When corn is used to make ethanol, there is less of it for food products. And when supply goes down, prices go up. And who is hurt most by the increase in the cost of food? Those who can least afford it. These potential impacts on Oregon's quality of life cannot simply be borne by those with the least economic power and those whose voices are least likely to be heard in the hallways of power. The burden must be shared. That is my responsibility. That is the next governor's responsibility. And for those of you who are making climate change policy an academic or professional pursuit, it is your responsibility too. There is one last value I want to mention, and that is our civic duty to hand to our children an even better Oregon than was handed to us. The benefits that are certain to flow from our commitment to reduce greenhouse gases, energy security, deeper snowpack, healthier forest, less congestion, new jobs, technological innovation, and abundant fish, among others, are gifts that rightly belong to future generations. These gifts are not yet ready for delivery. But after 8 years as governor, I know that we are much closer. And with your help, the delivery date is a day I can easily foresee. Thank you all very, very much.
The governor has agreed to take a few questions, so if we have questions, especially from students, I'm looking for. Yeah.
Governor, your administration, I think, was instrumental in bringing to the attention of Oregon citizens and consumers the importance of waste reduction and its impact on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I didn't hear you say that today other than in respect to recycling buildings.
Well, you know, the question you ask is a great one because, and I hope I answer this in what you're getting at. There was a bill in the legislature in '09 that wanted to, on the biomass issue, and we put into it, the legislature put into it the waste facility in Kaiser, the burner. And I had a very serious concern of whether that was actually renewable energy source. I actually have changed my position on it, and I actually think it is, and I'm going to tell you why. I actually think waste and energy, there's a combination here. The United States, we're afraid of this issue for a variety of reasons, whether it's the NIMBY approach because we don't want one of these next to our yard or something, or we're worried about the noxious gases that can be emitted from it. But the truth is that the technology around cleaners in these facilities, and in Denmark, if you want to see it, and I've been over there and looked at the facility, they actually have reduced these down to such a level that it's less than 10% of the materials that are being emitted out. And they are using, and they put them in some of the most unusual places. But the EU, which I visited to talk about this issue, actually are using more and more of these. Now, the United States is not, we're falling behind in this. But my belief is you can't keep putting our waste in the landfills. You just can't keep, you know, in Europe I understand that they have a smaller area, and so they have to look at different technologies. But we seem to have the idea we can put a landfill any place. It doesn't make any difference because we've got all the space, but it is a terrible thing to do. And I think that we have to do more on recycling, and we have to do more on waste as far as disposal of it. And I think it can be done and produce energy and actually help us reduce CO2 emissions and actually reduce our demand for more coal or any other type of energy source that would be fossil fuel based.
Yes?
You talked about the viability of a carbon tax in Oregon, and I understand there's constitutional ramifications to that, but viability between the revenue and...
Do you work for Peter DeFazio? Peter and I argue this. As you know, I introduced a cap and trade proposal in the legislature, and I was the source of it with the Western Climate Initiative. I still believe in it. The issue, I think, that, and as lawyers, I can tell you, and it's a preemption argument that I think that we're going to have to come to grips with the federal government. I don't think a carbon tax would work just on the state. I think it is an issue at the national level. I would like to hear a debate about it. I think it's You know, if in fact you're going to change conduct and the way people live, a carbon tax is probably the best way to do it. That's now, there's certain inequities in it, I believe. But the fact is, that is the way you change people's conduct about waste, is they pay for it. And they'll learn very quickly, don't do that. The cap and trade system, you know, actually is the alternative to it, and came out of the acid rain situation on the East Coast with the sulfur oxide that was emitted. And they set up a market mechanism because that was basic, and this is the distinction between what we're talking about and about acid rain. That was an identifiable group of emitters who we knew were the cause of this problem, and they were basically large coal generators on the east, in the Northeast. And they could actually develop a smaller market, and it worked quite well. And we are now trying to copy that on a much larger area. Whether that's doable is another issue. Again, I don't ask me why I spend so much time with the EU. They do all these things. And when I went over there, I talked to the minister and his staff about this issue of cap and trade. And he says, well, what would you like me to tell you? And I says, I want you to tell me what I shouldn't do. Because, as you know, the EU has had some one step forward and two steps back on this, and they're still having trouble with it. But I think that whether you go to a carbon tax or a cap and trade system, I think there needs to be a debate in Congress. The legal issue is whether Congress is going to give the states some latitude, such as if they do not pass cap and trade now as part of their energy program, whether they'll give regional organizations like the WCI the flexibility to actually bring about a system here in the WCI, where we have about 8 states and about 5 Canadian provinces. And I believe that if in fact that we actually had that authority through the federal government, we would actually, I think, get more states to join us and build a much stronger regional program out west here.
Yeah, I'm wondering, the WCI and most of the other cap and trade programs don't permit borrowing except for during the same time period.
I didn't hear you. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. The WCI doesn't permit borrowing of emissions allowances, except for maybe 1 year into the future. The federal program proposed is going to allow them to borrow up to 15% of their allowances from up to 5 years into the future. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on.
Look, this, there is no, I wish I could tell you that there was an answer to your question. And what I think you're going to see is just whether you're going to have a market-based system or you're going to give them out, or whether you're going to, how you're going to do it, is all part of the debate. And if you look at what the WCI did, we had these debates internally. And there's good arguments on both sides. And so I think that it's something I would like to see come out nationally and have a great debate about, and I want the debate about the carbon tax as well, because I went to Vestas over in Denmark, and they actually were arguing for the carbon tax as a better way than cap and trade. And it was actually because of this conduct issue of how you get people to change the way they do things.
Governor, do you find that first having research into green energy technologies and then the production of green energy technologies would be a viable economic replacement to traditional manufacturing?
Help me.
Oh, just traditional manufacturing plants, industry, et cetera, as such.
I think that technology, and it's just not around energy. I mean, it's a critical piece of it. But you know, with nanotechnology and things of that nature on size, I think anything's possible. So if you're asking me of whether, in fact, that I think that there will be smaller, will not be the huge industrial emitters like we've had in the past, I think one could look out and see it that way. That is a possibility, because I think with technology, think of it this way. If we ever moved to a feed-in tariff system where you could put solar panels on your house And I had a system where, in fact, let's just say, hypothetically, we generated 50 kilowatts. And I had a system that if you only use 20 kilowatts in your house, you got the feedback in, and we would not only give you the rate, but we would give you certainty for how long you could do that. You could feed it back into the grid. What I get is the advantage for you to have more income. And at the same time, you're going to be looking for every energy efficient product. It is another way out of the carbon tax to get people to change, because you will see an advantage to doing it. And I think if you want to see it, Germany has moved to that system now. The German state has a much larger social footprint than I think we would tolerate here in this country, but right now. But the fact is that I think something like that changes considerably how people live. And I think it also can be applied to where they work, because businesses could get the same opportunity as individuals could. Yeah.
If climate change is really an enormous issue, why is it still legal to clear cut, and why are we planning almost $20 billion of water in highways?
You know, it's a very good question. And let me say this. This is probably one issue that I think that we're going to actually come together on with the environmentalists and the wood products and the industry. And the reason is, first of all, I think all of us know that, at least I believe, that the concerns about climate change and warming temperatures are real. If the forests are put at greater risk because of drier climate, less rainfall, smaller snowpack, we are going to have to manage the forest in a way that we do not have catastrophic forest fires. And that is, you're going to have to do commercial thinning, and you're going to have to get on the forest landscape and brush clean so that, in fact, we don't burn them down. The issue, though, that I think will really bring us together is whether it's a cap and trade system or a carbon tax or whatever it is, I think there is tremendous economic potential to maintain old trees for the offset for carbon, for their value to those who own the land. I think it's a tremendous advantage because, as you know, in Oregon, we're being challenged with our land use system because of the fact that as the ability of the people who own the land and own the trees to actually find markets and to be able to get on and cut the trees down, they're trying to move toward development. And that's what I think Measure 37 was all about, was this idea that the industry felt that they wanted to basically put their land into a real estate investment trust or a TIMO or some other investment device, and then in fact, if you don't give them an opportunity to get a return on it, they're going to look for other uses of that land. And I do not think that's good for Oregon long term. So I think the debate about climate change and about the forest, there is a synergy out here between the environmental community and the industry to start working together as partners.
Given that the federal government continues to drag its feet on the climate issue, what do you think the role of WCI is going forward?
If, you know, we actually had a discussion about that, and as far as I can only speak for myself, if the federal government does not act on the climate change issues, WCI is going to go forward. We're going to go and start using the legislative processes again in the respective states to move forward with it. We're not going to let this thing die.
The EPA recently released regulations on mobile source emissions of CO2, and we're expecting regulations on stationary sources too. How do you think that regulation of CO2 under the Clean Air Act might affect state efforts to regulate carbon emissions?
Well, since Oregon is a state that we run the Clean Air Act here in Oregon through the DEQ, and since we have to comply with whatever federal standards that they have, we're going to adopt them, and we're in the process of already doing that, of adopting the federal standards. We have to do that to stay in compliance. You know, as lawyers, let me suggest something about administrative the process and about one of the things that I've been intrigued by over all these years is we're working on a model of government administrative law that came out of the 30s with the Roosevelt era, and it is a system in which we establish rules, and if you don't obey the rules, I come in and I either fine you or I do something to you to get you to comply. I actually am beginning to believe more and more of being of view that I have to be a partner with people that I want to do something with. I cannot just be the enforcer. And if I give you an example, and I'll use the forest lands, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years, and if there's one thing I've heard the timber industry and timber owners tell me is that they are the stewards of the land, and they believe deeply that they are stewards of the land. If that is true, if I established a set of regulations on setbacks, stream health, all the other things you would like to see, and say, look, here's the deal. If you agree to manage your land in this manner, the benefit for you, and let me just pick one out of the air, what they all complain about to me is their need to sell their land if they, or their family has to sell their land if they pass away because they can't pay the inheritance taxes. But what if I told them, Oregon, at least for what I can do on the state side, we'll forgive you on the inheritance tax side. But understand there are penalties in there, and there will be a regulatory process in the sense that we will see that you do what you said you're doing. But if you do it on a voluntary basis and they get something for it, I just think that there has to be another way that we look at this. I'm coming to the belief that as population grows and we get more people, which is an issue itself, but as that is, it's a reality, I can't keep growing government to the size to do everything everybody wants it to do. And I've got to find a better partnership model with people who the government works with. It's just, and look, I'm the first to tell you, I would be concerned about voluntary compliance and relying upon people just on their good faith, so I need some structure to it, but I'm not sure that the club approach is the way to do it. I've got to find some other enticement to get people to do these things themselves.
Biomass again. I think it's a bad choice of source of energy because it's not only bad enough to be cutting down trees, but once you cut them down and you have the chips on the ground, that is the stuff that becomes the soil afterwards, out of which new trees will grow. If you turn that into ash, you need all that waste. I don't think that's waste. Microorganisms turn that into soil.
That is an argument that I've heard many, many times, and I don't have an answer to tell you that it's not true, that in fact that's what happens, but there are other issues other than I just said the environmental issues. To be very frank with you, one of the issues that I think the state faces economically with the wood products industry is to finding a way where they actually can generate revenue, and the biomass facilities, which is why the legislature put them in under the renewable portfolio standards, is to give them that type of an opportunity. I think it is wonderful for getting the clear cutting off, the brush off the forest and doing the commercial thinning. That's the direction I think that they're going to go with this. So I think it is a win-win. It makes biomass, I think, as an opportunity not only to provide revenue, but it makes for a healthier forest.
Okay, one more question, Kim?
I just want to ask the question about roads again. I know that there are federal restrictions on how you can use certain money from the Department of Transportation, and I think there's a constitutional issue when it comes to the gas tax in Oregon, I think. But are we pushing our federal officials, our representatives and senators, to give more money? I understand that that there's money to buy buses, but there's not money to run buses in some communities in Oregon. There's money to build, billions of dollars worth of new roads, but we don't have the money going into public transit that really is
Well, if you listen to President Obama and the debate that he's having with the earmarking issue, I think that that's what they're trying to do, and I'm looking at my colleagues in the legislature. I think he calls it the Infrastructure Investment Bank, that the president is trying to get these funds into, where the policy choices would be made based upon a policy choice about public transportation or high-speed rail or whatever you want to do, rather than the current way we're doing it at the federal level. Now, I'm not served in Washington, D.C., but I know the politics around doing away with earmarks is a very, very contentious issue. And whether they will allow the president to put all that money into this infrastructure investment bank, I don't know. I think it's a great idea, because I think that we should be making these policy decisions like you just articulated, but the system is set up today doesn't do that.
What about geoengineering as the least bad option if we've got a disaster at some point? But the trends are, it looks like that we're not going to make it otherwise. I was wondering if there's any thinking going on, at least at the state level, about geoengineering.
Help me again.
Putting sulfur dioxide or reflectors up in space.
Oh. I don't know. I don't know if the people in Lakeview do not like parabolic troughs out on the countryside. I don't know if they're going to like them anymore up in the air if they know that they're there. I don't know. Look, you know, if I could, and I'm going to close. What I hope you got out of this from a policy perspective is there are no easy answers to this issue. It is not yes or no. And what happens is that if you truly want to move to a carbon-free economy, you're going to have to make choices. You can't take everything off of the table. Because if we take everything off the table, we're going to continue to do business just as we're doing it. And I'm telling you, more than anything else, watch the global economy. Watch the Indias and the Chinas and the Brazils. You know, if there's anything in traveling this world as the ambassador for Oregon, I can tell you what everybody in these countries wants. They want what we've got. That's the truth. And maybe it's not a good thing that we've set this model up that everybody looks at us and says, what do you want? I want it just like you got it. And if that's the case, there's not enough. And so we've got to figure a way, and I think the United States has to take the lead role in reducing our consumption of all of this world's resources. It can't be done. It's not possible. And that's why I told you that if, in fact, that you look at India and China on the oil issue, and you look at us consuming 23% of the world's resources, there's certain inequities in this, and it will not withstand time. It will change. And I think the lesson for people like me is to lead the American people into that change rather than waiting for some cataclysmic event and then we all are forced to change. That's not the way to approach this. And that's what the debate to me about climate change is about planning, about leadership, about preparing for the future. Thank you all very, very much.